Welcome back to the Better Business Analysis podcast with your host, Benjamin Walsh. And today we dive into a topic that I had on probably a weekly basis, and I try to frame it under the heading, connecting all the bits and pieces. And what I mean by that is that we need to connect our systems and our processes to generate value for our business. That's part of the reason we are business analysts and why we are business professionals. And it requires two mindsets, the business mindset and the technology mindset. And that comes under what is classified generally as enterprise architecture. But today we're going to dive in why and how and what you might want to integrate across your business and how you can explain why this is valuable to a C-suite.
The Better Business Analysis Institute
presents the Better Business Analysis podcast with
Benjamin Walsh.
Talk to business leaders all the time about this. Most of my day involves doing some kind of technical advisory, even though I'm a business architect and analyst. And it is around explaining that there isn't really an easy solution to all their problems, as in there is no one box that will solve their problems. And I'm going to give you an example. So ERP systems or enterprise resource planning systems are great for manufacturing, right? And there are business models which suit that one platform to rule them all. Very few businesses that I deal with necessarily require multi-million-dollar ERP. But even if you do have that and you're big enough to need that kind of system for your industry or your size, there are other systems you have. You have email clients, you have Microsoft Productivity Suite or Google Productivity Suite, or you have some custom apps in AWS. All of those things are part of what's called your architecture. And I talk a lot about business architecture. That's the game I play and enjoy. But today we need to think about how does the processes and the people and our environment, how does all of that relate to our technical architecture? And usually what you will have in an organization is someone called an enterprise architect. And that name sometimes is given to more than one person. But the idea of enterprise architecture is to do both the business side and to connect the technical side. So your technical architecture, and you'll find that people that usually have the term or the job title enterprise architects are actually enterprise technical architects. And so they look at this end-to-end state and they draw these really high-level solutions, which is fantastic. We need these. We need to make some decisions around our technical architecture. And I'm just going to say architecture for the rest of the episode. And you need to just assume I'm talking about technical architecture here. So if you have your ERP system, you need your productivity suite. So you need, your Word and your Excel, and you need your Teams, and you need your Outlook. You need all those underlying functions, regardless of which vendor provides them. But generally, you buy them bundled, and you can't ignore that. So you're buying the Microsoft suite, or you're buying the Google suite, or you're doing some kind of open suite. There aren't actually that many options. So you're using that, especially in a corporation, and that is where your data is flowing. Your data is flowing and living in those systems, and you're producing there. That's your interface, right? Then you might have an operational system or an ERP, as I talked about before, or a CRM system. You've heard these terms. And you are storing information in a structured way in those systems, which may integrate with your website, which is another interface, a touch point for your customer. And then maybe you've got a reporting suite like Power BI or Tableau or something, which is connecting to your operational systems, usually more than one, because you've got a financial system and a CRM and something else. And that all needs to come together in a cohesive way, ideally in an easy way, ideally in what we call kind of single storage of data. So you're not storing the data in more than one place. So that costs money when you store things, especially in a cloud environment. You have to move data, you have to integrate these systems, and it all becomes complicated. So the first thing that a CTO or a CIO more so, or a CEO will think about, the C-suite will think about, especially if they're not hugely technical or haven't come from that background, is they don't understand the inner workings of that. They may not care. But the reality is to operate, you need to care, you as a BA and you as an architect. And it needs to be efficient. And if these systems aren't sending information back and forth and don't talk to one another, then your business process is inefficient and therefore your business is inefficient. So I'm going to cover off quite a few ways here that you can think about this problem, how you can connect the bits and pieces. Okay, number one is the digital glue. So why do we care about connecting these systems? I've touched on it. But data, primarily data, so if you get rid of all the complexity of systems, a C-suite executive or a person on the street can understand this, that data, a piece of data, is only powerful when it flows, just like water through a system. If you have disconnected systems, then you have inefficiency, you have duplication, you have data silos, you have risk, you have potentially trust issues because one area of the business doesn't know about what's happening in the other area of the business, or they come up with two different results. From a BA's perspective, disconnected solutions break processes, they frustrate users, and they create blind spots for decision making. So a great solution, regardless of what it is, a Salesforce or whatever you're putting in, the widget that you're putting in, that's not connected to the rest of the ecosystem, is like a smart person talking to themselves in like a soundproof room. Doesn't matter how smart that one component is. If it can't talk outside of that to the rest of the systems, the data's not flowing, you really haven't got any further in terms of what your enterprise needs. Into a little bit more detail here. Business functions are really isolated. So the functions that support your processes are really isolated. So a customer journey crosses multiple systems. Customer journey is what your customer's trying to do to get their job done. And so that will go from CRM, maybe a CRM system, to your ordering system, to fulfillment, to billing support. Most organizations will not have that all in one system for good reasons, which we'll touch on in a minute. So therefore, your customer journey experiences and has touch points with all of those areas, either directly or indirectly through phone call, email, website. So when systems aren't connected, it's not just an IT problem, it becomes a business performance issue. And these silos, they kill visibility, reduce agility, and create inconsistent data stories, which is where this trust issue comes. So an example would be in education. A student record might live in, the attendance system. It might exist in, say, the ministry's financial aid system. It could exist in the reporting platform. It could exist in a learning management system. And if they're not all connected, tracking a student's well-being or performance becomes manual or error-prone, okay? And that's kind of the world I'm living in at the moment in some ways. And then we'll jump on to the number 2 point. So we know that it's important to have this glue, but why can't we just put it in one system? Why one system to rule them all kind of fails in reality? So it's really tempting, especially for executives. You'll get this in your life. I have on an executive team where it's easy to imagine one mega platform that does everything. Okay, but it creates complexity. It's rigid. You end up probably spending a lot of money on customizations because those systems are so big and they have to have such a wide scope. They're not really focused on doing one thing well, and therefore to get the differences you want for your business, you have to customize it. And then it's longer delivery timelines when you want to change something because you're generally going through one vendor. And then you're locked into that vendor and your data is locked in sometimes. Even if even though we're getting better at having some policies and decisions out there worldwide that allow you to get your data out. So one system to rule them all becomes one system to slow them all. Does that make sense? So that's kind of a good analogy there. And I know from my experience that if you're a smaller business, it might be really great to have one system. But number one is don't necessarily spend your time looking at all the features of that system. Look at its integration ability, okay? And if it's got great integration ability with other systems that vendor doesn't own, so it uses an open system, APIs, all the rest of it, connects to Zapier or whatever other integration platform that's out there, then that's a good sign, okay, compared to one that doesn't. It doesn't mean you should buy it. It could be really crappy in terms of how it fulfills the use case, but it definitely has one of the attributes you need to worry about, which is integration. And I guess the other point about that is that these systems have this romantic notion of simplicity, but actually it really comes at the cost of agility. And they're quite hard to evolve. And even systems which are behemoth or monolithic, like ERPs, like SAP, for example, would be one of the world's biggest. The ones that do well and don't have this problem the most have actually started to create their various areas. So, customer management or inventory management. They have created those as separate apps that then live on a platform. So a platform with various apps that talk to one another is much more preferable than a system which has tightly integrated modules that cannot be pulled out as separate apps. If you want to know more about that, it starts to get quite technical, but there are a few systems out there that are built that way. So I'd say a Microsoft Dynamics 365 and a Salesforce are more of what the latter, where there are modules, and it allows optionality for choice. An example would be here, if you take a large public agency, they will try and consolidate all their data into one massive ERP or a data warehouse or whatever. And years and millions later, they had a slow, rigid system no one liked and ended up kind of layering smaller tools on top just to make it usable. That happens a lot, especially if you are locked into a vendor and that vendor doesn't upgrade their system, or that system has decided to invest in function but not user experience. So it's really hard to use from a UI point of view. So it doesn't look very nice, but it happens to be feature rich. Again, SAP comes to mind. Okay, so what's the other end of the spectrum? The other end of the spectrum is something that became really popular a few years ago, and you may have heard the term. It's called microservices. So you can go to the other end and go, well, that's bad having one system. Why don't we just have lots or thousands of microservices, sorry. And that isn't the answer either, but I'm going to explain why. Microservices, they promise agility and scalability, but only when governed well. Okay, because you could still have many disconnections, right? And you have to create these kind of mini solutions. So you end up with chaos in the integration layer. And you end up with kind of a bit of a dependency problem between the systems. And then you have to manage the security and the maintenance headaches you get across. So I would say that microservices done badly are just as kind of dysfunctional as one behemoth. But in saying that, if you are a custom product shop, or you really understand it and you understand your architecture well, and you don't have lots of microservices, just a few that are manageable, it is a better option than just having one behemoth. However, that isn't the sweet spot. Let me just give you one kind of example of where you might use microservices in a good way, because I don't want to, it is quite new and it is better than what we've had. And that is when you're doing kind of scaling large systems. But it only works if you've got governance and orchestration and documentation. So everything has to have high levels of integration, which is what ideally the reason for having a microservice is that's what it allows you to do, because it does one thing really well. And you need to be able to have kind of API gateways which are managing all that. And you need to have kind of a service mesh to manage the communication. And you need kind of like document interfaces. So a fintech startup might be good because it's got different services that do things well. But if you don't invest in service discovery or contract versioning and your deployment processes, then it's really hard to work out where and what services are breaking your processes if something breaks. So what I would suggest for most businesses, and like I said, there's no one rule to kind of fix your problem, is really when you're looking at the sweet spot. And that is just integration done right in my simple terms. And that is when your solutions are modular and loosely coupled, so they're not tightly coupled, but they're tightly aligned, not to necessarily each other, but to the business capability and the step in which your users and your customers are wanting to perform. So you need to focus on business-driven integration. So you can connect where data flows, but only if it's valuable. So another way of saying that is to connect where value flows through value streams. And you need to think about what I would affirm. We overuse this word actually in our argument about what this word means today, but it's around prefer platform thinking over point-to-point hacks. So platform thinking being something where you've got your base services. Platform for me isn't necessarily Azure or AWS. It is having these consistently used services you want across your organization as a base, and then building these kind of areas which have value in their own space as separate systems or services. So let me say that another way. If you were like, for example, wanted a CRM system, most CRM systems out there now will integrate, HubSpot, Microsoft CRM, or it's Dynamics 365 and Salesforce. They actually have really good integration layers. And if you love that tool and system, it's probably okay to use it because it integrates well and it's decoupled for CRM. And it makes sense to do all your CRM in one place. So all those processes are tightly coupled from a business process point of view and a value point of view. Now, what makes sense, for example, is have that as its own system, but then any of your authentication layer or maybe your web content or anything that's shared would be on the platform. So it's okay to have that as its own system and to use integration to move data around. But I would say you wouldn't want more of 4 of those big things. Does that make sense? You wouldn't want to break that CRM system down to lead management and then have another interface which was managing your customers, managing your opportunities. If you had those as separate services or systems, it would become chaotic, right? That's why we have CRM systems in the first place. But you don't necessarily want to grow that system out so it does everything. So you can use things like integration patterns, and you can use things like business capability maps, which is a business architecture term, to really anchor the integrations that you need and where the value flows. I would suggest that what you could do to figure out if you should maybe buy a kind of a package system like a CRM system to fill your needs, or an ERP, or both, or which systems you should look to integrate more closely, or which ones you could specialize in and have a tiny microservice widget to the side, is to map out the information flow. So map out the information flow across business processes, where data starts, where it travels and where it's consumed. Use the data management lifecycle to do that. Identify the integration pain points. So where is manual re-entry? Where is inconsistent data? Where do you need to reconcile? That's always a bad word. Or you've got kind of what we call swivel chair operations. Where are the touch points for your customer? And start speaking the language of integration, like understanding what a webhook is, data contracts, APIs, REST APIs, integration tools like Zapier, Make.com, 8N, which is a free tool. And then collaborate with architects to shape integration patterns that make sense for your business, not just IT. And if you draw that up and you work with your enterprise architect, then when you make a decision about what systems you should introduce to your ecosystem, it becomes way easier. Okay. And then there is some insights you can, and some patterns you can draw. So for example, if you are using the Microsoft Office suite and you have Microsoft Dynamics 365, it probably makes sense for you to use Azure, which is under all that, to do some small services. For various reasons, cloud cost, moving of data, the way it stores it, contracts, authentication. It might not make sense for you to go, oh, there's something great in AWS. Let's just change our pattern for that because it's going to cause you headaches. These are all the worlds of architects, but it's a great example. Again, if you're using the Google Suite and you're a startup company and you're doing everything fast and custom, maybe on AWS, maybe on Google Cloud, introducing the Microsoft Teams, and then using that to save your documents doesn't really make sense. You should use Google Drive. So you can start to generalize some of these patterns, and that you will see, if you're working in a space, you start to hit these same conversations again and again, especially with management. So is your business more like Frankenstein or Iron Man? Frankenstein, which is stitched together with no plan, or Iron Man, where there's modular components that are seamlessly connected? As a BA, your job is to help build Iron Man. I'll see you next week.